Hi, everybody, and thanks for coming, even though it was after lunch. I hope you are still awake. I'm going to talk about a leaner approach to draft. So as you may know, we just shipped a new version in SAP CDS, the Node.js package. And in this new version, we introduced a new way of doing draft. Because frankly speaking, the old way of doing draft was a bit cumbersome. So this talk is focused on the Node.js library. So if you're a Java developer, I'm sorry, but maybe you'll learn something. Okay, so I think most of you know what draft is. Quick show of hands, who knows what a draft is? Awesome, perfect. So it's the thing you have to enable to get a nice Fiori Elements UI. That's simply put. So what it does, it creates those shadows tables and all those changes the user types in the UI will persist it. So they are stored safely and the user can continue later on and no change is lost. So that's basically the main idea. All right, and on this list report, you all know this filter editing status with all those different draft scenarios. So that's basically what the CAP server has to support in order for Fiori Elements to work. So if you look from outside, we have the following boundary conditions for the CAP framework. We have this OData layer, and on the OData layer, we only have one entity. In this case, it's called travel, and travel has two keys, ID, and this strange looking key is active entity. On DB layer, you have two database tables, one for the active instances, it's called travel, with only the real key, if you will, ID. And then we also have this other table, this shadow table, which is automatically created for draft, where also here you have travel entity, in this case, travel.drafts, and also an ID key. All right, and the boundary conditions are that we might not change the active table because it shall be possible for you to have a normal entity, non-draft enabled entity, put some data in there, and only later on activate the draft for this entity. And the data should still work. So these are the boundary conditions. Now, the CAP framework now is in the unfortunate situation that we have to deal with this, right? This mismatch of having one entity on our data layer and two entities on DB layer. And it's not so easy, especially if you look at some of these draft scenarios, which are sent by Fiori Elements. So there's this one strange looking filter, maybe you have seen it already. It's this is active entity equals false or sibling entity slash is active entity equals null. That's not really readable, right? So you can get the rough idea what's meant. So it's meant, okay, give me all those drafts or give me the ones where the sibling entity slash is active entity equals to null. So the meaning of this is give me the drafts if I have an own draft for this entity. If I don't have an own draft for this entity, show me the active instance instead. So in the list, you can basically get the effective view on this. And for the CAP framework, this is a very complicated request because now we have to retrieve the data not only from one database table, but actually from two database tables. So we have to retrieve the active ones, the draft ones, and also mix them together on application layer. Now, before CDS 7, before we shipped this new lean draft layer, we basically did everything on the database layer. So we mixed and matched those drafts and active entities on DB layer. We used, for example, an SQL union, which has all kinds of problems. For example, it doesn't really work well with localization. Some things don't work, not all. And it's not orthogonal to all other features CAP ships. And in the past, we also had to make sure, always had to make sure that if we implement a new feature, that it also works for draft, because it was kind of polluting our code base. And that is basically proof that it really polluted our code base. So if you grab for the keywords draft or is active entity, that's how we usually identify drafts in our whole runtime folder, and you count the occurrences, you get 978 occurrences. This is quite a lot. The emoji I put for illustration. And if you, then you might think, okay, maybe it's just in one file, maybe it's fine. Actually, no. If you count the unique files of those occurrences, you will find out that it's 85 different files in our generic code, just for the draft. And of course, if this is the solution to draft from CAP, we got a lot of issues. And this is a highly sensitive internal screenshot of our internal GitHub. And you can see that we have 450 closed issues which contain the word draft. So it's a huge time sink for us, for the developers who have to fix those, and also for you who have to, or for my colleagues who had to open all these issues, because it's just, yeah, not really great. In addition to that, there also have been a lot of questions, in particular this one scenario where stakeholders requested that the active entities are in one system, let's say S/4HANA, but the drafts are stored in the own database, which is a very nice scenario. And we just couldn't support it, because if we mix and match on DB layer, it's basically not possible. So also in your custom handlers, it was always kind of a mess. Let's take this simple example. You register a read handler service on read travel. What you get is you have a rec target, but does it point to the drafts? Does it point to the actives? And what's up with this strange where clause? That's exactly the where clause you would get if you remember this OData request I've shown you before. Is active entity equals false, or sibling entity is active entity equals to null? Nobody knows really what that means, and you have to know what that scenario means. So in our generic framework, we actually have a mapping which maps exactly those scenarios to the semantic meaning of the scenario, so we can do the appropriate thing. So for stakeholders, that's a mess. I'm sorry for that. I was responsible for that. So the way forward is a leaner approach. With version 7, we now had the possibility to do also some, introduce some breaking changes, but also make it a lot cleaner. So now we have some principles. Principle number 1, the database layer must not know anything about drafts. This was particularly important because we have now new database drivers, which are currently in development for SQLite, for Postgres, and for HANA. And it would be kind of bad if all of them would need to implement some draft-specific logic. We don't want that. They shouldn't know anything about that. For them, it should be an entity, queries, and that's it. The second one is actives and drafts are retrieved with separate queries. Only with this method, we can make sure that also this scenario works where the actives are in a completely different system. Otherwise, there's no chance. And we also want to have a proper distinction between actives and drafts in service handlers. So you should know what with what entity you're dealing with, right? The actives or the drafts. This should be clear based on the rec target. And we also want to be pragmatic, because all of those points cannot be fulfilled without being pragmatic, without having some trade-off at one or the other area, but it works. So how does it work? So first, we take the query, which is translated from the OData protocol, which has these weird filter conditions to identify the scenarios, and we move it through a sanitizer, right? And this sanitizer gets rid of all this stuff, which we don't like. And out comes one or sometimes also several queries, which are clean, which have only properties which you know. And then your custom handlers and our generic handlers are called with these cleaned up queries, where the target is defined, where the properties are defined. And once your handlers return the data, we combine them back to the result and propagate it to the UI. That's basically the gist of it. Now in your handlers, it's a lot easier to reason about it. So you have read handlers, let's say for travel. And this read handler is only active for all read requests to the active instances, if you read the active instance directly. If you want to register a handler for drafts, you just register a handler for the drafts. In both cases, rec target is exactly what you think it is. In the first case, it's travel, the active entity, and in the second one, it's travel.drafts, the draft entity. A lot cleaner. And the same holds true for all other requests. Now we also have all CRUD requests. You can register them on travel. You can register them on travel.drafts, as you're used to with all other entities. Actually, you don't even need those strange draft events like new, edit, and so on and save. And just do that. They're still there. Yeah, there's a question. Yeah. Yes. I mean, unofficially, it's also available in a version before, but it was not documented. It was kind of a hidden release. Yeah. But you should upgrade to CDS7. Okay. Yeah, so we have a cleaner code base. Now we have proper season entities for actives and drafts. Before it was kind of a strange season lookalike for those drafts, but now it's a proper entity where also the where all associations and compositions also point to the corresponding counterpart. For example, if you follow a composition, you will stay within the draft tree, and it points to the corresponding draft entity. The implementation now only spans 2 files. So those, how many were there? 89, 85 was now reduced to 2. So that's cleaner. And hopefully leads also to fewer issues. And the best part, there's no special handling in other layers. So all new database drivers, they don't have to know anything about it. They just execute those queries, and that's it. Of course, there are some limitations, some trade-offs, which we have to take into account. So for example, in this list status all, that was the screenshot I shown you before, where the drafts and active entities are mixed together. They are now mixed together in a slightly different way, which personally I think is better, because now all drafts are shown on top, right? Before, drafts were kind of sorted in with the active instances, and it could be that you created a draft and you don't find it because it's on page 13 or something. Now all drafts are on top, so it's easier to find them, a lot cleaner. For the user, it's better. Filtering on draft administrative data is not possible anymore unless you adhere to these officially agreed upon draft scenarios sent by Fiori Elements. Otherwise, you can't filter on them because that would just create a performance bottleneck, and we don't want that. So this is not supported. If you want to do this, you can always write custom handlers and do the appropriate things. That's fine, but it's not supported generically. Usually, you also don't filter upon those. And those draft properties, that is, has active entity, has draft entity, all these fields which actually don't really exist, they are only computed for the target entity and not, for example, if you do an expansion, then those children will not have these draft properties. And also here, Fiori Elements usually doesn't need those. So why should we compute them? We should be pragmatic, so the performance is good. And if nobody needs it, why should we compute it? It looks a bit strange, no data, because then you will see that those values are null. It's not nice, but again, we are pragmatic. We just want to make it work in a fast way, in a clean way, and that's guaranteed here. All right, now let me show a demo. And this is not just a simple demo where I just show a lean draft, because it basically behaves the same as before, except that the draft's down on top, so you won't see a big difference. But I will show a demo which is a bit more interesting, because it now shows a scenario which was never before possible with the old implementation of draft. I will show you now 2 applications with the realistic names app1 and app2. And in app2, I store all those active instances. You can think of it as a pseudo S/4HANA system if you want. And in app1, I only want to deal with my own drafts. Right? So I want to change it, modify it, keep it close in my own database. But only when I save it, the request has to be sent to app2, and the active instance has to be posted. So let's try this. So I start app2 on port 4006. Just a basic application which stores conferences. And now app2 basically has the same entity, but only deals with the drafts. Also here, I start it. Open it. It's an app about conferences. And if you look closely, you see that it's cut off at 2021. That gives you a good indication that this app was generated with CapGPT, because the data was cut off in the year 2021, because I was too lazy to create one from scratch. And it lists all conferences, SAP TechEd, Microsoft Ignite, and so on and so forth. So this data is retrieved from app2. So let's check the logs from app2. You can see if I press on go here, you can see a GET request is coming to app2, which holds the active instance. Now let me create a draft. And of course, I create recap. Start date is today. I think it was at 9. Doesn't matter. And date also today at probably 23 o'clock. Yeah, let's see. So let's just say SAP SE description, best conference ever, and also organizer is SAP SE. Now you can see in the bottom that the draft is always updated with every change, so works as usual. If you navigate back, so I keep the draft now, you can see in the list both are shown. And if you look at the server logs, you can only see the GET requests for the active instances in app 2. While in app 1, you can see the post request, to create this draft, and the GET request to retrieve the draft data, and so on and so forth. That's working as expected. And now the interesting thing happens if I click on create. Let's go back here before I click. So you can see here we only triggered GET request, so just information retrieval. Now I click on create. You can see now we send a post request to the external system to save the active instance. This was never before. Now, how did I do this? There's a little bit of custom implementation involved. You have to write a custom handler to delegate the request. At the moment, it's not as nice as I want it to be. But the moment we can get rid of the old draft implementation, things will be simpler and we can approve, so you don't have to do all this stuff. It's still not much coding, but it will go away. So what we do basically is we remove those properties which we don't like for this remote system, like those draft properties, and then we just delegate it to the external system. And also here, we are thinking of a way how to enable this scenario in an elegant way, and we came up with this property _data source. It's not official because it has an underscore, and this way you can basically say, instead of going to the database directly to retrieve the stuff, use the application service, and then this handler is also triggered. And with that, I hope you have a lot of questions. So just shoot. Thank you.
Before I kick off with the question from the chat. So what's about edit case? Activate entity would still be there.
Oh yeah, I
the draft one in app 1.
All right. So app 2 is still running, so I can just leave it, but I have to start this again. Let's try this out. Question. So I click on edit. So before I click, let's look at the requests. I click on edit. Now there shouldn't be any request to the active system, which is true. There's no request to the app 2, but there's a post request to trigger this draft edit action. So now a draft is created in my own local persistence without the active system knowing anything about it. Now if I click on save, activate it, and now the remote system got the corresponding request. So also that works. Of course, there are things like, well, actually that works too. Locking should work too, because we check if we already have a draft, and that also works. So yeah, this scenario support.
Good. Questions from the room? Yep.
You said that the special events for the draft will be gone, but that means basically we have the normal events on the draft entity, right? Those.
No, that's not entirely correct. So we have the CRUD requests for the draft entity. As you saw, all CRUD requests are available. So for example, if you create a draft, the create on drafts is triggered, as you would expect. But some draft events are still enabled. For example, the new event is still there. Then now I have to think. Save is also, save, by the way, is not a draft event. It's just a shortcut for create update. So that's also still there. And then I have to think what other events are there. So a few of them we kept, but patch is not there. That's the only one we removed.
Okay.
Because that's absolutely not needed anymore, because that's just an update on drafts.
So new is still there, so we can basically fill default values in that still.
Yeah. You can absolutely do that. You can plug your handlers into any step in this draft choreography. Yeah.
You said patch is not necessary anymore, but patch was fired on every on enter in an input field, and now the update is fired.
Yes, now the update is fired. So you just switch patch to update and you're good. There's also, I didn't mention it, did I put it in the slides? Yeah, there's also here this compatibility mode. If you don't want to change your handlers because it's too much effort because you have thousands of handlers, you can also switch on draft compat true. Then we fake the handler registration a bit so that it still looks like it's the old draft, but it's actually the new draft. It's not a full compatibility, but with respect to the registration, it still works. So same events, same entities would still work.
I come from the little world of SAP Business One, and there we also know the working with drafts. So my first question is, where do your drafts live? Do they live in the area from one person, or are they stored generally anywhere where other persons and colleagues also can work with their drafts?
Yeah, so drafts are stored in your own database. So usually you have one database for your application, and the drafts are stored in a normal database table, like any other database tables. Now, with respect to several users, we have security measures. So if a draft for a certain entity already exists, another user cannot create an own draft unless the draft has somewhat timed out, like after, I don't know, 15 minutes or so. The draft is still there, but it becomes overwritable by the user who wants to edit the same entity. So if you change something, you go on vacations, after a while your colleague can still continue working on it. And then the draft is discarded from you.
I think it's another consideration. So it's the draft in this way is only a storage for my homework or for my personality work, and the drafts on another level, another quality, and to perhaps in the future, the drafts from SAP Business One has to renamed.
Yeah.
One comment was I can just engage you, look really at all the filters which are available in the Fiori generated Fiori Elements app, because they show you a lot of like what possibilities you have, all this editing status. Check it out there, and that helps.
Yeah. So you have, just to go through it, you have all, which means your own drafts. Unless you don't have an own draft, then show the active counterpart instead. Then you have all hiding drafts, that's only the actives. Then you have unchanged. That means all those entities which do not have a draft. Then you have own draft, which is self-explanatory. Then you have locked by another user. That is entities which have a draft which are not yours. And you have unsaved changes by another user. That is if there's a draft by another user which is timed out, so you can overwrite it and discard it. Quite complicated stuff. I would have made it a lot simpler.
Hi, David. First of all, thanks for splitting these things up, because we discussed this on January as a stakeholder on a real customer need. And for us, this is a great opener, because we are integrating sales service, cloud services stuff. And this, especially in this area, we discussed this with the Fiori Elements team. We currently, also in the midterm, do not want to support non-draft services for offering CRUD functionality. And we discussed this also in Fiori Roundtable. And then finally, with the solution that came up, why not using CAP for draftifying such version 2 service? And they're using the in-memory database for the draft. And then we got all these issues with this not splitted handler so far. And now this is possible. And at the end, you have a lot of possibilities, even with Fiori Elements. It wasn't possible before, because now you can draftify data version 2 service. You can even draftify your REST services to use Fiori Elements on top of your REST service. And at the end, that offers a lot of new possibilities. And also Marcel Wächter as lead core from the Fiori Elements team, we also discussed this stuff concerning the form create pattern, or the page that we discussed. Would be nice if if you re-enter the form creation pattern, would be nice to see the draft formally if you started one, like Andreas Kunz event app in the stuff. And they've also confirmed that they will implement this, so that we next will have this form entry page that you see if you started working on a form, leaving and coming back, you will have this draft state. And if you then press create, now you can just go, and the hook for the post will go to your real backend system so far, and that offers a lot of new functionalities and possibilities in this area.
Exactly. Thanks. So what you're mentioning, so just for the others, so there was this before lean draft, it was possible to somewhat create drafts in the own table. I think you wrote a lot of custom handlers to make that work, but it was never possible to show it in a list, right? You only had to have a UI, which basically only allowed you to create something, maybe also delete it and save it. That was basically possible. But you couldn't see a list of all your stuff you created, right? And so, I don't know, you couldn't delete things which you had as a draft, right? That was impossible. But now it's possible. Now you can use the plain standard Fiori Elements list report. You can see everything. You can see your own drafts. You can see the active ones. All filters work. So I think it's a lot better now.
So we call it a web. Thank you, David,